All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about Vivitrol. Just a little bit of background, what we do at Alkermes, that's the company I work for. We try to take gold standards of existing medications and find a better way to deliver that medication to the patients. So if anyone's familiar with Risperdal Consta or Invega Sustenna, two antipsychotics, that's Alkermes technology, even though they're Janssen products. And Vivitrol is the first commercial product that we decided to keep for ourselves. And all Vivitrol is, it's naltrexone in an injectable form, and it's indicated for both alcohol and opioid dependence. I have a lot of slides here, but because of time constraints, I'm going to try to go through as rapidly as I can, and I'm going to skip a few just to get to the meat and potatoes of this. And please, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to jump in. These are just some of the statistics, but we just know that, in 2016, 10.6 million adults used prescription pain relievers for non-medical purposes, and that's a pretty big deal. 80% of heroin users previously misused prescription pain relievers. I don't think this is anything new. I mean, this is something that we're seeing and reading about every day. But I'm going to get right into the meat and potatoes of this. And like I said, with Vivitrol and with any other MAT, there's two regions of the brain that are real important in treating this disease. The first one is the cortex, because the cortex, that's where counseling is going to help, because the cortex is the front part of the brain, and that's where the client is going to make their decision making, their thinking, their reasoning and planning. So counseling is really going to work on the cortex, really to get them to change their habits, get those life coping skills and defense mechanisms that they're not going to relapse. On the right-hand side, and here in the middle in the blue, you can see the limbic system, and that's where MAT is going to work. And the medication is going to target that limbic system. That's that brain reward pathway, and that's where you get your basic drivers and urges and rewards and pleasure. And that's where Vivitrol is going to work, methadone, Suboxone, etc. Once again, this is just a little diagram of understanding the brain and pleasure. And as you can see with these little dots here, in our brain we have endogenous opioids. And when they land on the different receptors in the brain, which is highlighted here in the red, it gives us pleasure. And this is also what the alcohol and opioids are going to do. And so I just want you to have a basic understanding that opioids, we have them in our body. We can get pleasure from either sex, food, exercise, and different activities like that. But it's the same principle that the alcohol and opioids are going to work on. And so understanding the brain and alcohol, it's the same thing. When a patient drinks alcohol, it's going to lead to a release of these endorphins here that are going to land on these receptors in the brain. And what it does is it stimulates the production of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And it's this excessive dopamine in the brain that gives the patient those pleasures, that buzz, that high. And it's the same with opioids. The opioids are going to stimulate the production of these endorphins. The endorphins are going to land on these receptors. It's going to stimulate dopamine, and it gives them the buzz or a high. And as we know, over time, either with alcohol or opioids, it leads to tolerance, right? They start off, maybe it's 4 beers, get them drunk, then they get up to 6 beers, a 12-pack, then it's a case. And it's the same with opioids. They start out with a little, and by the end, their tolerance is getting real high. I'm just going to skip these because I really want to get into what is Vivitrol. So once again, Vivitrol is indicated for the treatment of alcohol dependence in patients who are able to abstain from alcohol in an outpatient setting prior to initiation of treatment with Vivitrol. Patients shouldn't be actively drinking at the time of initial Vivitrol administration. And when we say that, we just mean they shouldn't be drinking that day when they get the shot. They shouldn't be drunk. We've had patients, they'll come into the office and you can smell the alcohol on their breath from the night before, but as long as they're ready, willing, and able to get the injection, doctors are giving it. They're not going to send them away, because if you send them away, you may never see them again. But once again, they shouldn't be actively drinking. And our best results with Vivitrol, and I'll show it later on, came in patients that were able to abstain from alcohol 7 days prior to a Vivitrol shot. We got the indication for alcohol in 2006, and in 2010, we got Vivitrol was indicated for the prevention of relapse to opioid dependence following opioid detoxification. And what that means is the patient has to be off opioids before going on to Vivitrol. They have to be off the opioids 7 to 10 days. When I say 7 to 10 days, I'm talking heroin, Percocet, OxyContin, something like that. If a patient was going to make the transfer from Suboxone or Methadone onto Vivitrol, that gets pushed out maybe 10 to 14 days. Because if not, if they have the opioids in the system, when they get that Vivitrol shot, it's going to land on those receptors in the brain that I had showed previously. It's going to knock that opioid off the receptor, whether it's the heroin, the Percocets or whatnot, and it's going to put that patient in a withdrawal. And it's going to be pretty fast. It would be within 15 minutes to a half hour. And then the patient's going to be showing those signs of withdrawal, nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, sweating, dilated pupils, and all that. And usually they'll bring them to the hospital for, and get them hydrated with fluids. And once again, we can't stress this enough, Vivitrol should be part of a comprehensive management program that includes psychosocial support. These patients really need to be in counseling. They have to get those life coping skills and defense mechanisms. Vivitrol is not a magic bullet. If they're on Vivitrol and they're still hanging out with their best friends and they're still using opioids, I don't care how good Vivitrol is, eventually they're going to join in with their friends. So they have to change their habits, and like I said, counseling is so very important in these patients. On the right-hand side, the only patients that really can't be on Vivitrol is patients that are currently on an opioid. So if they're on an opioid for a legitimate reason, if it's back pain, unless they can manage that back pain with Tylenol or aspirin or something, they're not a Vivitrol candidate. And it's also category C in pregnancy, and that's up to the doctor. They're going to weigh the pros and cons and the risk and benefits of whether or not the mother should stay on Vivitrol. For the most part, they usually do take them off, though. Once again, what Vivitrol is, it contains the opioid antagonist naltrexone. And what it is, it's these little microspheres that get injected into the rear upper outer quad. And it's these microspheres, and they're almost like dissolvable sutures. And the medication is in these microspheres, and the microspheres get spread out throughout the body. And it's the water in the body that will make them get bigger and bigger. And that's how Vivitrol gets extended release over a 1-month period. So it's a once-a-month shot, but these microspheres will get bigger and bigger and they'll burst, and that's how the medication gets released over the 28-day time period. And once again, they have to be off opioids 7 to 10 days. As you can see on the right hand, so what is Vivitrol? It's a monthly extended release of naltrexone. Has to be administered by a doctor. Can't be a mother or father giving their son or daughter the shot. It's an opioid antagonist. It's a blocker. We are a blocker. It's non-addictive, non-narcotic. It's not associated with diversion. It does require detox, and it does require counseling. And once again, this is just a diagram of how Vivitrol works. I always think of Vivitrol as a stop sign, because when a patient's using alcohol or opioids, as we can see up here, it's going to stimulate those endorphins. Those endorphins are going to want to land on these receptors to stimulate that production of dopamine. Think of Vivitrol as a stop sign. It's going to block that receptor. And by blocking that receptor, it can't stimulate that production of dopamine, and the patients can't get the buzzer high. That's the deterrent with Vivitrol. One other thing that Vivitrol does help with, it does help with cravings. And I'm going to get into some of the data of that as we get along. But those are the two ways that Vivitrol works. It prevents the patient from getting the buzzer high, and it does help with the cravings, so hopefully they don't relapse, because cravings is usually a big reason why a patient will go out and use again. A couple things to keep in mind is one is the vulnerability to opioid overdose. And just remember, we said Vivitrol is a blocker. It blocks that mu opioid receptor. It's an antagonist. So a patient has to be serious about their recovery if they're gonna go on Vivitrol, especially for opioids. Because once they're on that, they can't try to overcome that blockade. So if they're used to shooting up one bag of dope and they have that Vivitrol on board, because it's blocking that receptor, nothing's gonna happen. If they go out and try to use a second, third, fourth, or fifth bag, they definitely run the risk of overdose. So they obviously have to be aware of that before going on Vivitrol. And like I said, they have to be serious about their recovery if they're gonna go on to it. This slide here is just showing how Vivitrol gets into their system. When they get the shot, within 2 to 3 hours, medication will be on board. It's gonna be at its highest at day 2 and 3, and then it's gonna tail off. And you can see through the timeline, it tails off through day 25 and 30. But they measured naltrexone levels, and even at day 28, 29, 30, there's enough naltrexone that's considered therapeutic effect. I always say this, these are the slides that came from our studies, and I like to say I live in the real world, and maybe, if you're familiar, you've heard patients say, I feel great on Vivitrol. It's really holding me for those first 3 weeks. Maybe the 4th week it's not holding them. Has anyone heard that before? Yes, no, yeah. So what doctors can do, they can either petition the insurance company to give the patient the shot every 3 weeks, or what they'll sometimes do is they'll add oral naltrexone that 4th week to get them through. But in all our studies, it showed that there was enough naltrexone at weeks 4 that was considered therapeutic effect. A lot of times I've asked the doctors, what do you think? Do you think it's really these patients are faster metabolizers and it's getting out of their system, or is it in their head? And most of my clinicians will say they think it's in their head. They know the medication's coming out of their system week 4. They get worked up, they get a little anxious, but it should be enough to get them through those 4 weeks. Another one is, once we talked about the opioid withdrawal, like I said, they just have to be off the opioid 7 to 10 days before going into Vivitrol, because if not, they're going to go into withdrawal. And the other key thing is to know what withdrawal is. And like I said, it's the nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, and it's what happens is the opioid is sitting on that mu receptor, whether it's heroin, Percocets, or whatnot, and when they get that Vivitrol shot, it's gonna knock it off and bind to it. But sometimes you can have patients say, oh, I can't go on Vivitrol, I'm allergic to it. And you'll say, what, you're allergic to it? And they'll say, oh yeah, I got the shot before and I had, diarrhea, vomiting, cramping, I started sweating, dilated pupils. That wasn't an allergic reaction. They were going into withdrawal. So it's real important to distinguish those two facts. Once again, this is just something to keep in mind too. On the upper right, you can see when reversal of Vivitrol blockade is required for pain management. Like I said, these patients are on an opioid blocker, so it's important that anyone that goes on Vivitrol will wear like a bracelet, little like Army dog tags, and they also carry a card in their wallet, and that's to let emergency personnel know that they're on Vivitrol. So let's say, God forbid, they get into an accident, break a leg, fall off a ladder, whatever. If they're brought into the ER, they're going to be in pain, but they have that Vivitrol on. It's an opioid blocker. So they won't give them an opioid for pain. They'll give them a non-opioid. They'll do regional analgesia. And the one thing they can do, and we kind of keep it on the down low, they can override it with fentanyl, but it has to be in a closely monitored situation for breathing purposes, because it's a really fine line to, how much they can give them to, relieve their pain without having them overdose. So that's why they have to be closely monitored in the ER setting. But they will get pain relief. We've had patients shot, stabbed, they've broken limbs skiing in car accidents, and the patients have all gotten relief from their pain. And you can see in the right, there's the bracelet, the necklace, the dog tags, and the ER cards. Once again, this is just a slide we talk about counseling. This is just our studies for opioid dependence. And just a couple quick things here to note. This was a study that was done in Russia. We did it in Russia for a couple reasons. One, they have a big problem with opioids, and two, they don't use Suboxone and methadone, and they're really into counseling over there. So these were treatment-naive patients to Vivitrol, and what they did is they got a once-a-month Vivitrol shot and heavy counseling, and over 6 months you can see that 36% of the patients in the study with Vivitrol were abstinent throughout the 6 months of the study. What's interesting to note is in the blue is 23% of the placebo patients remained abstinent for all 6 months of the study. So once again, this just shows what the power of counseling is. I mean, they were getting a placebo injection. It wasn't even the real thing. But with the counseling, they were abstinent for all 6 months in the study, 23%. Where we really separated from placebo, though, is right here is these are the median patients that were in the study on Vivitrol. And the median Vivitrol patient was abstinent for 90% of the time in the study, which was 18 out of the 20 weeks. The placebo patients, they were only abstinent for 35% of the time in the study, which was 7 out of the 20 weeks. But this is probably the most important slide I'm going to show today, and it's how Vivitrol helps with cravings. And I'm going to be honest, I don't even think we understand how Vivitrol helps with cravings because it doesn't, in a lot of ways, scientifically, it doesn't make sense, because I talked about how Vivitrol is a blocker of those mu opioid receptors in the brain, whereas, methadone and Suboxone, they land on those same receptors, but when they land on them enough to satisfy them enough that the patient doesn't get the buzz or high, and it satisfies them enough that the patient doesn't go into withdrawal. So it makes sense why methadone and Suboxone are going to help with cravings. Vivitrol is a blocker. Like I said, it's an antagonist. So in a way, it doesn't make sense that it helps with cravings. But we have a few studies out there, and the patients, will come in. Obviously, the only way you can measure cravings is it's self-reported. But patients have told us that the cravings really diminish with Vivitrol. And in this study, you can see here's the baseline going across here. These are the patients that were on placebo with the counseling, and it's just hovering about baseline. But with the Vivitrol, there was a big decrease in cravings, and it was statistically significant. So it's really important that Vivitrol helps with cravings and it prevents the patient from getting that buzz or high. I'm just going to keep on going. This was another study. This was just published in the last year. This is a head-to-head study versus Vivitrol and Suboxone. And there's just a couple key findings out of it. The first one isn't anything new to us that are familiar with Vivitrol. And it shows that the patients on Vivitrol had a 65% relapse rate versus 57% for buprenorphine and Suboxone. But this number here in the 65%, that's in all the patients that were in the study. That was in the intent to treat patients. So that includes the patients that they couldn't get through the 7 to 10 day induction period with Vivitrol off opioids. So we know that. We know Vivitrol is a little bit more labor intensive than methadone or Suboxone. We know that. They have to get through that 7 to 10 day window and get off opioids before they can go on Vivitrol. So we know that. So when we saw that 65% versus 57, it was no surprise to us. We got it. What was interesting, though, is that when you then look at the patients that did get on Vivitrol, 52% of them were, the opioid relapse with Vivitrol was 52% versus 56% for Suboxone. So we've never made claims of superiority versus Suboxone, but what we've been fighting for with Vivitrol is to say we're just as effective. 2 different medications, and it's up to you to find out what is the right medication for that patient and meet them where they are in recovery. So I'm not here to say Vivitrol is better, but I am here to say it's just as efficacious as Suboxone, but it's matching the right patient up with the right medication. And then once again, this is another slide, so it's head-to-head, Vivitrol versus buprenorphine, and it's for cravings, and Vivitrol's in the dark blue. And as you can see, we got the early jump on buprenorphine, and this is Vivitrol going here, and then the Suboxone's here. But at the end of 6 months, they met at the same point. So once again, both medications are effective, and we're just as effective as the buprenorphine for cravings. This was just another study, another one done versus Suboxone. It was done over in Norway, but the results were the same. They mirrored the same. So I'm just going to keep on going just for time purposes. I just want to talk a little bit about alcohol dependence, because that's where we got our original indication. We got it in 2006, and basically, I'm going to go a little more freestyle than the slides. Basically, we had about 600 patients in the study. 92% of the patients were actively drinking when they came into the study. And when I say actively drinking, they were averaging 10 to 12 drinks a day. For the next 6 months, they get a once-a-month Vivitrol shot, and they got twice-a-month low-impact therapy. It wasn't like an IOP program. It's just like, hey, how you doing? How you feeling? At the end of the 6 months, those patients went from, on average, 19 heavy drinking days in a month down to 3.1. Heavy drinking day is 5 or more drinks in a day for a man, 4 or more in a day for a woman. So just getting that Vivitrol shot and little low-impact counseling, they went from 19 down to 3 heavy drinking days. Like I said, that was 92% of the patients in the study. The other 8%, maybe they were a little bit more motivated before coming into the study. They were abstinent for 7 days prior to entry. Same thing, once a month Vivitrol shot, twice a month low impact therapy, and at the end of 6 months, they went from on average 15 heavy drinking days in a month down to 0.2. So when the FDA gave us our indication, they said that the patient should be abstinent before drinking. But once again, they didn't say what is abstinence, day, week, month, year, hour, they didn't say. And the Vivitrol package insert, like I said, they just shouldn't be actively drinking at the time of initiation with the shot. And that's what these slides were showing. So I'm gonna end it there.